The Confederate States of America existed as a functional, governing entity for exactly 4 years, 1 month, and 2 days. In the grand, sweeping timeline of human history, that duration is less than a blink of an eye. It is a mere historical fraction. Yet, in that incredibly brief, violent window of time, this unrecognized republic managed to mobilize an entire society for total war, field some of the most lethal and effective armies the North American continent has ever seen, inflict catastrophic, generation-defining casualties upon the United States, and permanently alter the psychological and political trajectory of the American story. This was not a loose, disorganized coalition of rebellious militias hiding in the woods. It was a fully functioning, rapidly assembled, highly structured nation-state. Within a matter of weeks, it established a president and a cabinet. It built a bicameral Congress. It drafted and ratified a comprehensive written constitution. It created a currency system, an international postal service, a sprawling military bureaucracy, an army, a navy, and a flag. And above all else, it had a singular, unifying, and absolutely uncompromising cause. For the last century and a half, a deeply entrenched, highly romanticized, and fiercely protected mythology has attempted to obscure exactly what that cause was. Generations of Americans have been taught that the Confederacy was a noble, tragic endeavor. They have been told it was built on the abstract philosophical principle of states' rights, framing the conflict as an honorable defense of regional sovereignty and constitutional originalism against a tyrannical, overreaching federal government in Washington. But the men who built the Confederacy did not hide their intentions in abstract political philosophy. In the winter of 1861, they were fiercely, unapologetically, and universally honest about exactly why they were tearing the United States apart. On the evening of March 21, 1861, just weeks before the first artillery shells would rain down on Fort Sumter, the newly elected Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander H. Stephens, stepped onto a stage at the Athenaeum in Savannah, Georgia. He delivered an impromptu address to a cheering, euphoric, standing-room-only crowd of Southern elites. That address became known to history as the Cornerstone Speech. It is, without question, the most revealing, devastating, and honest political document the Confederacy ever produced. Stephens looked out at the rapt crowd, and he explicitly explained exactly how their new government was fundamentally, philosophically different from the one founded by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson 85 years earlier. The prevailing ideas entertained by Jefferson and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. This was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it fell when the storm came and the wind blew. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. The Vice President of the Confederacy stood on a public stage and proudly announced to the world that their new nation was the first government in the history of human civilization to be explicitly, legally, and philosophically founded on the absolute supremacy of the white man and the perpetual enslavement of the black man. This is video 42 of our series. Today, we step across the newly drawn border to examine the enemy the Union was about to face. We are going to explore the vast, terrifying nation that tried to destroy the United States. We will examine the deeply flawed, deeply tragic, and intensely rigid figure chosen to lead it from Richmond. We will read the exact, unedited text of the Constitution they wrote to govern themselves, and we will answer the most difficult, complicated, and haunting question of the entire Civil War. If this nation was built exclusively to protect the staggering wealth of an elite class of slaveholders, why did hundreds of thousands of poor Southern dirt farmers, who owned absolutely nothing, willingly marched into the meat grinder to defend it? If you were to design the absolute perfect resume for a 19th century American statesman, it would look exactly like the life of Jefferson Davis. In the years leading up to 1861, Jefferson Davis was widely considered by both Northerners and Southerners to be one of the most capable, brilliant, and powerful men in the United States. He was the quintessential Southern aristocrat, but his path to power was forged in military discipline and deep personal tragedy. He was a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. Following his graduation, he served on the harsh western frontier during the Black Hawk War. It was there that he fell deeply in love with Sarah Knox Taylor, the daughter of his commanding officer, future United States President Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor fiercely opposed the marriage, not wanting his daughter to endure the grueling life of a frontier army wife. Davis resigned his military commission just to marry her, but the romance ended in absolute devastation. Just 3 months after their wedding, both contracted severe malaria in Louisiana. Davis survived. Sarah did not. The grief utterly broke him. Davis retreated from public life for 8 years, isolating himself on his Mississippi plantation, spending his days reading massive volumes of history, constitutional law, and political philosophy, forging the rigid, inflexible intellect that would later define his presidency. He eventually returned to the public eye, and when the Mexican-American War erupted in 1846, Davis raised a volunteer regiment, the 155th Mississippi Rifles. At the Battle of Buena Vista, Davis executed a brilliant tactical maneuver, forming his men into a V shape to break a massive Mexican cavalry charge. He was shot in the foot, but remained in the saddle, bleeding profusely, until the battle was won. He returned to the United States a legitimate, celebrated national war hero. Following his military glory, his political rise was meteoric. He served brilliantly as the United States Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce, overseeing massive modernization efforts of the Federal Army, expanding the Capitol building, and advocating for a transcontinental railroad. By 1860, he was a highly influential, fiercely intelligent United States Senator from Mississippi. He was a man of the world. He was highly educated, but his wealth, his status, and his entire world view were inextricably bound to the institution of human bondage. Davis was a massive plantation owner. At his sprawling Briarfield estate in Mississippi, he personally owned over 113 enslaved human beings. Unlike some earlier Southern founders, men like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, who viewed slavery as a necessary evil or a tragic moral failing that might eventually fade away, Davis belonged to a new, deeply entrenched generation of Southern leaders. He had convinced himself through immense intellectual rationalization that slavery was a positive good. He operated his plantation on a model of paternalistic racism. He genuinely, fundamentally believed that the institution of slavery was divinely ordained by God, that it civilized and protected people of African descent, and that the southern plantation was the highest, most perfect, and most harmonious form of human society ever created on earth. He could not conceive of a world where white and black people lived together as political or social equals. When the Deep South states seceded in the winter of 1860, their delegates met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form their new federal government. The very first order of business was to select a president.
The radical, fiery politicians who had screamed the loudest for secession for decades, the fire eaters, men like William Yancey of Alabama and Robert Barnwell Rhett of South Carolina, were universally considered too unstable, too extreme, and too polarizing to actually lead a new nation on the global stage. The Confederacy desperately needed to project an aura of calm military authority, aristocratic dignity, and political legitimacy to the courts of Europe. They chose Jefferson Davis, but it was a choice that Davis himself never actually wanted. On the day he received the news of his election, Davis was in his rose garden at Briarfield with his second wife, Verena. A messenger arrived carrying a telegram from the Confederate Congress in Montgomery. Verena Davis later wrote a profound, chilling account of watching her husband open that telegram. She noted that as he read the words, his face grew so pale and his expression became so suddenly stricken with grief that she genuinely thought a close member of their family had just died. Davis did not want to be a politician anymore. He was, at his core, a military man. His greatest ambition, his lifelong dream, was to be appointed the commanding general of the Confederate armies, to ride at the head of a glorious military campaign to defend his homeland. Furthermore, because he had served as the United States Secretary of War, he knew the industrial capacity of the North intimately. He knew, better than almost anyone else in the screaming, euphoric crowds of the South, exactly how incredibly difficult, bloody, and devastating a total war against the manufacturing might of the United States was going to be. He knew the Southern people were vastly underestimating the North. He knew the presidency was a poisoned chalice. But his sense of duty, his honor, and his devotion to his state were absolute. He packed his bags, said goodbye to the plantation he loved, and traveled to Montgomery to take the oath of office. History has endlessly compared Jefferson Davis to his counterpart in Washington, Abraham Lincoln. And in almost every crucial metric of wartime political leadership, Davis falls tragically, catastrophically short. While Lincoln was a political genius who knew how to bend, how to compromise, and how to manage the massive competing egos of his fiercely divided team of rivals cabinet, Davis was catastrophically stubborn. He was a notorious micromanager who completely refused to delegate authority. He would literally sit in his office for hours, arguing endlessly over minor administrative details like the promotion of a specific obscure colonel or the design of a uniform button, while the strategic picture of the war burned around him. If you disagreed with Jefferson Davis on a matter of military strategy, he did not view it as a political difference of opinion. He viewed it as a personal, unforgivable insult to his honor and his intellect. He held deep, bitter grudges that actively crippled the Confederate war effort, maintaining fierce, petty feuds with some of his best and most popular generals, like Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard, simply because they had wounded his immense pride early in the war. But to understand Davis as merely a stubborn, flawed, ineffective politician is to miss the profound human tragedy of his time in office. His presidency was marked by agonizing physical deterioration and emotional torment. He suffered from chronic, blinding neuralgia, a severe nerve condition that left him in excruciating, agonizing pain, completely blind in his left eye and confined to a darkened, silent room for days at a time. He was trying to run a massive continental war against a superior industrial power while his own body was essentially tearing itself apart.
And then, in the spring of 1864, while the Confederate armies were crumbling around him and the Union forces were marching on Richmond, he suffered the ultimate personal nightmare. His beloved 5-year-old son, Joseph, was playing on the high balcony of the Confederate White House. The boy slipped, fell to the hard brick courtyard far below, and died of massive head trauma. Jefferson Davis was a man who watched his country, his wealth, his physical health, and his family completely destroyed over the course of 4 brutal years. He spent the war carrying a burden that broke him physically and psychologically. But despite his immense personal suffering, despite his deep military knowledge, and despite his unquestionable dedication to his cause, Davis was fundamentally leading a government that was built on an inescapable moral and philosophical contradiction. And to see exactly what that contradiction was, to strip away the century of lost cause mythology that has shrouded it, we have to read the actual document they wrote to govern themselves. When the Southern delegates met in Montgomery, Alabama in the late winter of 1861 to draft the foundational blueprint for their new nation, they didn't start from scratch. They didn't invent a new system of government. Instead, they took the United States Constitution, the sacred document drafted by George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, and they copied it almost word for word.
If you look at the macro structure of the Confederate government, it is a perfect mirror image of the United States. They had a House of Representatives, they had a Senate, they had a Supreme Court, they had a president who served a slightly different 6-year single term, but possessed essentially the same executive powers. They even copied the Bill of Rights almost verbatim. The architects of the Confederacy genuinely believed they were the true, pure inheritors of the American Revolution. They believed they were preserving the original, uncorrupted intent of the Founding Fathers, merely correcting the progressive errors and anti-slavery sentiments that the North had supposedly introduced into the American political system over the previous 80 years. But it is the differences, the specific, deliberate, and chilling alterations they made to the original document that absolutely, undeniably destroy the modern mythology of why the Confederacy existed. After the Civil War ended in total Southern defeat, apologists for the Confederacy spent decades meticulously constructing a false historical narrative. This narrative, known as the Lost Cause, argued that the war was never fought over human bondage, but rather over the abstract noble principle of states' rights. They argued that the South simply wanted the tyrannical federal government to leave the individual sovereign states alone to peacefully govern their own domestic affairs. But if you ignore the post-war propaganda and actually read the Confederate Constitution, the supreme law of their land, written by their own hands in 1861, you realize that the states' rights argument is a complete, total, and deliberate historical fabrication. The Confederacy did not care about states' rights. They only cared about one right, the right to own human beings. And they explicitly used the massive centralized power of their new federal government to crush any state's right to ever interfere with it. Let's look at the exact text. In Article 1, Section 9 of the Confederate Constitution, the framers explicitly stated, "No bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed." This means that the Confederate Congress in Richmond was constitutionally banned permanently and forever from ever passing a law that would slowly emancipate enslaved people or gradually abolish the institution of slavery. But the document goes much, much further than that. The ultimate, undeniable proof that the Confederacy utterly despised states' rights when those rights threatened slavery is found in Article 4, Section 2.
This specific clause stated that citizens could travel to any state in the Confederacy with their enslaved people, and their right of property in those slaves shall not be thereby impaired or questioned. What does that legal jargon mean in practice? It means that if the state of Virginia or the state of North Carolina or any other sovereign Confederate state suddenly had a change of moral heart or a change in economic strategy and voted democratically to abolish slavery within their own state borders, they were constitutionally forbidden from doing so. The Confederate federal government explicitly stripped the individual states of their sovereign right to abolish slavery. You were not allowed to be a free state in the Confederate States of America. It was federally illegal. And regarding the great explosive issue of expanding into the Western territories, the very issue that had broken the United States and caused the war in the first place, the Confederate Constitution was absolutely ironclad. Article 4, Section 3 declared that in all new territories acquired by the Confederacy, the institution of Negro slavery, as it now exists in the Confederate States, shall be recognized and protected by Congress and by the territorial government. There was no popular sovereignty. There was no letting the local frontier settlers vote on the issue, as Stephen A. Douglas had proposed. The powerful federal government of the Confederacy mandated by supreme constitutional law that slavery must permanently expand into every single new territory they ever acquired, whether in North America, Mexico, or the Caribbean. The men who wrote this document did not mince words. They did not hide their intentions behind polite political euphemisms. The original United States Constitution famously deliberately avoided using the words slave or slavery, referring instead awkwardly to other persons or persons held to service. The American Founding Fathers, fully aware of the horrific moral contradiction of enshrining slavery in a free republic based on liberty, deliberately kept the ugly word out of the document, desperately hoping the institution would eventually die a natural death. The Confederate Constitution deliberately, explicitly, and proudly used the word slave over and over again. They permanently enshrined it as the unalterable foundational bedrock of their entire civilization. As Vice President Alexander Stephens had so accurately and brutally declared, slavery was the cornerstone. But this undeniable, documented reality presents us with the greatest psychological, sociological, and historical paradox of the entire American Civil War.
If the entire purpose of the Confederate States of America was to protect the massive, multi-million-dollar financial investments of a tiny, wealthy plantation elite, why did the Confederate Army look like this? Because the men who bled to death for the Confederacy in the Peach Orchard at Shiloh, in the Bloody Lane at Antietam, and charging the stone wall at Gettysburg were not wealthy plantation owners. They were poor, illiterate dirt farmers who didn't own a single slave, who lived their entire lives in grinding poverty, and who had absolutely no financial stake in the institution of human bondage. So why did they put on ragged gray uniforms, leave their starving families behind, and willingly march directly into the mouths of Union cannons? To answer that, we have to look away from the politicians and look directly into the eyes of the men in the ranks. If you look at the mythology that was meticulously constructed in the decades after the war, the Confederate soldier is almost universally depicted as a noble, aristocratic gentleman. He is portrayed as a tragic knight defending his ancestral plantation home, his sacred honor, and his genteel way of life against the invading industrial Yankee hordes. But if we strip away the romance, if we open the census records and look at the actual hard demographic data of the men who marched into the meat grinder of the 1860s, that mythology instantly shatters into 1,000 pieces. The reality is that roughly 3/4 of all Confederate soldiers did not own a single enslaved person. They were not wealthy plantation aristocrats.
They were poor yeoman dirt farmers, mechanics, and laborers. They lived in small, crude, one-room cabins, often scratching out a bare subsistence living in the red clay hills of Georgia, the deep pine backwoods of Alabama, or the rocky, unforgiving mountains of Tennessee. They had absolutely no financial stake in the vast, multi-million-dollar cotton empire of the plantation elite. In fact, the institution of slavery actively harmed them economically by artificially depressing the wages of free labor and concentrating all the region's wealth and political power into the hands of a few thousand elite families. So why did they fight? Why did hundreds of thousands of poor white men willingly bleed to death to protect a system that kept them in grinding poverty?
The answers are deeply complex, highly human, and profoundly tragic. First and foremost, the vast majority of these men fought for the simplest, most primal reason of all: home defense. When Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 federal troops to invade the South in the aftermath of Fort Sumter, many poor Southerners who had actually voted against secession suddenly and enthusiastically enlisted. They didn't view themselves as taking up arms to defend the economic portfolio of a wealthy slaveholder. They viewed themselves as fighting against an invading, hostile foreign army that was coming to burn their farms, conquer their towns, and subjugate their native states. Second, the psychological weight of peer pressure and community loyalty in the 19th century American South was absolute. In a deeply rural, highly localized community, if the local men were forming a volunteer regiment in the town square and you decided to stay home, your life was effectively over. You were branded a coward. Your family was ostracized. Women would refuse to speak to you, sometimes mailing you women's undergarments as a brutal symbol of your perceived lack of manhood. For a 19th century man whose entire sense of self-worth was tied to his public honor, the social shame of staying behind was a fate worse than a bullet. And finally, there was the terrifying, undeniable motivation of racial fear. The wealthy planter class and the Southern politicians had spent decades deliberately terrifying poor white citizens with the prospect of abolition. They successfully convinced the poor, non-slave-holding majority that if slavery ended, millions of newly freed black Americans would suddenly compete with them for scarce land and jobs, demand political equality, and ultimately destroy the strict white supremacist social hierarchy that gave poor white men at least one group of people they were legally permitted to look down upon. They fought to preserve a racial caste system that granted them a psychological wage, even if they had no actual economic wealth. But as the war dragged on, as the staggering casualty lists grew, and as the reality of modern, industrialized slaughter set in, the stark, unforgiving class divide between the men who started the war and the men who were dying in it became impossible to ignore. In the fall of 1862, facing a catastrophic manpower shortage, the Confederate Congress passed the first National Conscription Act in American history. It was a deeply controversial draft law, but it included a specific legal loophole that absolutely infuriated the poor men freezing in the ranks. It was formally known as the 20 Negro Law.
This law explicitly stated that if a white man owned 20 or more enslaved people on a plantation, he was legally exempt from military service. The official bureaucratic rationale for this law was that white men were desperately needed on the massive plantations to manage the enslaved population, maintain discipline, and prevent violent rebellions while the army was away. But to the poor infantryman, shivering in a flooded trench in Virginia, possessing nothing but a rusty musket and a handful of parched corn, the message sent by his government was brutally, unmistakably clear. The blood of a rich man was legally more valuable than the blood of a poor man. We have hundreds upon hundreds of surviving letters from ordinary Confederate soldiers expressing their bitter, furious, and heartbroken resentment at this specific law. A common, devastating phrase was coined during this period, and it began to echo through the Confederate camps from Virginia
to Mississippi. They wrote over and over again, "It is a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight." Yet despite this bitter, burning resentment, despite the staggering inequality of their society, the ordinary Confederate soldier fought with a ferocity, a tactical brilliance, and a terrifying, almost superhuman endurance that stunned and blooded the Union Army for 4 years. They marched hundreds of miles without shoes, they fought without adequate food, and they absorbed horrific, mind-numbing casualties. As historians, we must acknowledge their genuine, undeniable courage and their astonishing tactical skill, while simultaneously recognizing the profound, tragic reality that their bravery was cynically manipulated and expended in service of an unequivocally unjust cause. Because when their endurance finally snapped, it didn't snap on the battlefield in the face of Union cannons. It snapped because of the letters they were receiving from back home. By the end of the conflict, Confederate desertion rates were significantly higher than the Union's, driven by men who could no longer justify dying for a system that was letting their families starve. When the men marched off to war in 1861, full of martial glory and singing patriotic songs, they left behind a Southern home front that was completely, structurally, and utterly unprepared to sustain a massive, industrialized continental conflict. The Confederate economy was a monolithic entity built almost entirely on large-scale agriculture, specifically the mass production of non-edible cash crops like cotton and tobacco for the global export market. It was an economy designed to make a few men exceptionally wealthy. It was decidedly not built to manufacture heavy artillery, weave millions of wool
uniforms, or quickly pivot to grow enough edible crops to feed both a massive standing army and a civilian population simultaneously. When the United States Navy successfully blockaded the southern ports, cutting off the vital export of cotton and the importation of European manufactured goods, the Confederate economy began to collapse with a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. At first, Southern women threw themselves into the war effort with absolute fanatical devotion. They organized massive, highly effective relief societies. They sewed uniforms by candlelight, rolled thousands of bandages, melted down their family heirlooms and church bells to be cast into cannons, and turned their own parlors into makeshift hospitals for the wounded. In many ways, the fierce, uncompromising patriotism and the sheer organizational willpower of Southern women sustained the Confederate war effort long after the military and economic situation became dire. But as the war dragged agonizingly into its second and third years, the reality of physics and economics took hold. Patriotism could not weave wool, and pride could not replace calories. By early 1862, and accelerating violently into 1863, the Confederate government in Richmond was trying to solve its massive debt crisis by simply printing millions of dollars of completely unbacked, worthless paper money. The resulting hyperinflation virtually destroyed the civilian economy. The price of a barrel of flour, which had cost a reasonable $5 before the war began, skyrocketed to an unfathomable $1,000 in Richmond. Salt became so rare and expensive that women resorted to boiling the dirt from the floors of their smokehouses just to extract the precious sodium to preserve whatever meat they could find. Food shortages across the South became catastrophic. The Confederate Army, desperate to feed its starving soldiers in the field, passed the draconian Impressment Act. This law allowed Confederate military officers to legally ride on to civilian farms and confiscate food, horses, cattle, and wagons directly from the civilian population, paying for the stolen goods with worthless government IOUs that everyone knew would never be honored. Poor women, the wives, mothers, and daughters of the very men dying in the freezing trenches of Virginia, were left completely destitute, forced to watch their children literally starve to death while their own government agents rode away with their last bushels of corn. In the spring of 1863, the agonizing desperation of the Southern home front finally boiled over into open violent rebellion against the Confederate government.
In Richmond, Virginia, the very heart and capital of the Confederacy, a massive mob of starving, furious women gathered in the streets. Armed with axes, carving knives, and pistols, they marched directly on the government and commercial districts. Screaming for bread, they smashed the windows of bakeries, warehouses, and merchant shops, looting food, shoes, and vital supplies, while the city authorities watched in absolute terror. This was the famous Richmond bread riot. It was a massive, humiliating public failure of the Confederate state. President Jefferson Davis himself was forced to ride out into the chaotic street. He climbed onto the back of a wagon, looked down at the starving wives of his soldiers, and threw all the money in his pockets into the crowd, desperately begging them to disperse and go home before he ordered the city militia to open fire on them. The riot was eventually quelled, but the deep internal fracture of the Confederacy was laid bare for the world to see. But it wasn't just starvation that fueled resistance on the home front. There was a massive, highly organized, and deeply committed political resistance to the Confederacy within the South itself. These were the Appalachian Unionists. In the rugged, mountainous regions of western Virginia, eastern Tennessee, and western North Carolina, the soil was far too rocky and the terrain too steep for large-scale plantation agriculture. Therefore, there were very few enslaved people in these regions, and consequently, very little sympathy for a bloody war fought to protect the wealth of the lowland planter elite. Hundreds of thousands of white Southerners actively, violently opposed secession. They hid draft dodgers in mountain caves, engaged in brutal, localized guerrilla warfare against Confederate tax collectors and conscription officers, and formed entire regiments that defected to fight for the Union Army. In the most extreme case, the Loyalist citizens of Western Virginia literally seceded from the state of Virginia, breaking away to form the brand new pro-Union state of West Virginia in 1863. The Confederacy was bleeding from 1,000 internal cuts. The slow realization among many Southerners that the war was fundamentally unwinnable began to spread like a virus through the starving towns and empty farms. But the most devastating, existential resistance on the Confederate home front did not come from starving women or armed Appalachian Unionists. It came from the very people the Confederacy was built to permanently enslave.
For generations following the Civil War, the architects of the Lost Cause mythology aggressively promoted one of the most deeply offensive, historically fictional narratives in American history: the myth of the loyal slave. They painted a tranquil, highly romanticized and paternalistic picture of enslaved people as perfectly content, simple-minded, passive observers who faithfully, lovingly served their masters and protected the plantations while the white men went off to war. They wanted the world to believe that the enslaved population had no political consciousness and no desire for their own liberation. The historical reality, documented by thousands of primary sources, military records, and post-war testimonies, is the exact polar opposite. Enslaved people were not passive observers waiting for Abraham Lincoln or the Union Army to save them. They were active, highly intelligent, fiercely determined agents of their own liberation. They recognized immediately that the chaos of the Civil War was the divine, chaotic opportunity they and their ancestors had been praying for, and they exploited it brilliantly. From the very first day of the war, enslaved people across the South engaged in a massive, highly coordinated and incredibly dangerous campaign of quiet resistance and economic sabotage. With so many white men drafted into the Confederate Army, the strict, brutal control mechanisms of the plantations began to fracture.
enslaved workers immediately recognized their leverage. They engaged in deliberate, calculated work slowdowns, severely crippling the Confederacy's agricultural output and exacerbating the Southern food crisis. They intentionally broke expensive farming tools. They feigned illness. They ensured that the Confederate war machine was starved of the very resources it needed to survive. And most importantly, they gathered and shared critical military intelligence. Enslaved people operated an invisible, highly effective whisper network that spanned the entire continent. They knew the local roads, the hidden river fords, and the mountain passes far better than the Confederate generals did. They knew exactly where Confederate troops were moving, where the supplies were hidden, and where the traps were laid. Whenever Union armies marched into Southern territory, enslaved people consistently became the most reliable, accurate, and vital source of military intelligence the United States military possessed. But their most powerful, revolutionary act of resistance was simply dropping their tools and walking away. Whenever the Union Army marched near a Southern plantation, the institution of slavery completely, instantly collapsed. Thousands, and eventually hundreds of thousands of enslaved men, women, and children made the terrifying life-or-death decision to abandon the fields,
navigate past Confederate patrols and vicious slave catchers, and flee directly into Union military lines. Early in the war, the Union Army and the federal government were legally unsure of what to do with these refugees, as the Fugitive Slave Act was technically still federal law. But the sheer volume of humanity forced the issue. The Union Army declared them contraband of war, essentially confiscated enemy property. They established massive contraband camps to house the refugees. The physical conditions in these hastily constructed camps were often horrific, plagued by rampant disease, exposure, and starvation. But for the hundreds of thousands of people living in them, the brutal, freezing reality of a tent in a contraband camp was infinitely preferable to the absolute soul-crushing terror of the overseer's whip. They were taking the first agonizing steps towards self-emancipation. The Confederate government and the Southern civilian population were absolutely terrified of this mass exodus. They realized that every single enslaved person who successfully fled to Union lines was a devastating double blow to their new nation. It was not just a massive loss of financial capital, it was the loss of a crucial laborer who was no longer growing food for the Confederate Army and who might very soon be digging defensive trenches for the Union Army. Watching this incredible migration of humanity, the great abolitionist leader Frederick Douglass made a brilliant, devastatingly logical, and ultimately undeniable argument to President Abraham Lincoln. Douglass argued, the Confederacy is actively using enslaved people to dig their trenches, build their fortifications, and feed their rebel army. If the United States government takes these brave men who have fled to our lines, put blue uniforms on their backs, and hands them rifles, we can simultaneously cripple the Confederate economy, destroy their army in the field, and end this war. It was a profound moral and military argument that would eventually change the entire course of the war, leading to the creation of the United States Colored Troops. But in the early summer of 1861, both sides were still completely blind to the agonizing length of the road ahead. They were both operating under a massive, fatal, and intoxicating delusion. As the spring of 1861 turned into the sweltering heat of summer, the Confederate leadership sat in their new capital, looked at the strategic board, and genuinely, absolutely believed they were going to win the impending war quickly and decisively. They were not crazy. From a purely theoretical standpoint, their optimism was based on solid 19th century logic. They built their supreme confidence on four massive foundational assumptions.
First, they believed wholeheartedly in the absolute power of King Cotton diplomacy. They knew that the massive industrialized textile mills of Great Britain and France relied almost entirely on the importation of Southern cotton to keep their economies functioning. The Confederate leadership assumed that the moment the Union Navy blockaded Southern ports, the British and French economies would crash. Facing mass unemployment and domestic riots, They believed the mighty British Royal Navy would have no choice but to intervene, shatter the Union blockade, and officially recognize Confederate independence. Second, the Confederacy possessed a massive, almost insurmountable military advantage: geography. The territory of the Confederate States was roughly the size of Western Europe. They had a massive coastline and millions of square miles of dense forests, wide rivers, and unforgiving swamps. The Confederacy did not have to successfully invade and conquer the North to win the war. They simply had to survive. They were fighting a defensive war on their own familiar soil, while the Union had to accomplish the nearly impossible logistical task of invading, conquering, and permanently occupying a massive, hostile continental territory. Third, they genuinely believed they possessed vastly superior military leadership and martial culture. And initially, Jefferson Davis was not entirely wrong to think so. The South had managed to secure the loyalty of many of the most brilliant, experienced, and highly trained officers from the pre-war United States Army, legendary men who had cut their teeth in Mexico. Furthermore, Southern culture heavily emphasized horseback riding, hunting, and firearms from a young age, making the average Southern recruit seemingly better prepared for the rigors of combat than a Northern clerk. And finally, their fourth and most fatal assumption: they fundamentally, disastrously underestimated the Northern will to fight. Southern politicians had spent years convincing themselves that Northerners were cowardly, money-obsessed merchants, factory workers, and recent immigrants who lacked true patriotism. They believed the North would never endure the horrific casualties and massive financial cost required to conquer the South, simply to force them back into a political union they despised. But as the years of blood and fire would eventually prove, every single one of these arrogant assumptions was completely, catastrophically wrong. Great Britain and France, harboring deep anti-slavery sentiments among their own working classes, would find alternative sources of cotton in India and Egypt, completely refusing to intervene to save a nation built explicitly on human bondage. The vast, imposing geography of the South would eventually be severed in twain, its great rivers controlled by Union ironclad gunboats, its heartland gutted by the brutal, relentless marching campaigns.
The brilliant, legendary Confederate generals would eventually bleed their irreplaceable armies white in overly aggressive, incredibly costly battles, unable to replace the men they lost. And, most catastrophically of all, the Confederate leadership completely, fundamentally underestimated the absolute, unyielding, terrifying iron will of Abraham Lincoln. And they underestimated the millions of Northern men, from the farms of Ohio to the immigrant slums of New York, who were willing to absorb staggering casualties and die in the mud to save the American experiment from being torn asunder. The Confederacy believed it would win quickly. The Union believed exactly the same thing. They were both about to be proven catastrophically, terrifyingly wrong. Two fully formed nations now existed on American soil. Both believed their cause was undeniably right. Both believed God was on their side. Both believed that if a war did come, it would be a brief, glorious, bloodless adventure that would be over in 90 days. But two sovereign nations claiming the same territory cannot occupy the same space indefinitely. Sitting in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, the very cradle of secession, was a federal military installation called Fort Sumter. It was an immovable, infuriating object of federal authority, commanded by a loyal United States major, sitting directly inside the borders of the new Confederate nation. It was the ultimate, unimmovable collision point. And what happened there, in the dark, early morning hours of April 12, 1861, would not just start a battle, it would completely shatter the illusion of a peaceful separation and define the next 4 years of American history in blood. In video 43, we travel to Fort Sumter. We will witness the spectacular 34-hour artillery bombardment that started the deadliest war in American history. We will watch as the country erupts into a frenzy of violence and patriotism, and we will meet the young men of both the North and the South who rushed to enlist, completely unaware of the industrial slaughter that was waiting for them just over the horizon. The political maneuvering is over. The American apocalypse is here. Subscribe to Nostalgia History. Share this video with anyone who wants to know the true story of the Civil War, and join us next time as the first shots are finally fired.